Hello, everybody. My name is Lynn Domina, and I am a professor and department head at Northern Michigan University, hosting this webinar series, Let's Talk Books at NMU. Northern Michigan University is located on the sacred homelands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy. Today, I'm welcoming Katie Booth, author of The Invention of Miracles, Language, Power, and Alexander Graham Bell's Quest to End Deafness. We will be taking some time off from this webinar series this summer, but look for us to return in September. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen the icons for the chat and for Q&A. Feel free to use the chat to talk with one another. If you would like to pose a question for our speaker, use the Q&A and I'll be monitoring the Q&A and I'll be able to repeat the questions to her later in the hour. If you see a question that interests you, you can give it a thumbs up icon and that'll move it to the top and I'll know that other people have that question too. This episode, like all of our episodes, is recorded and it will be available within a few days on YouTube. If you'd like to see that recording, you can, of course, just search for it on YouTube using Let's Talk Books at NMU, or you can just send me a message at english@nmu.edu and I'll get it and I'll be able to send you the link directly. Before we get started, I want to thank several people. First off, Matt Herbig from Audiovisual Services here at NMU, who is helping us with the technical end of the program. And to Dr. Rob Wynn, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, who is supporting us financially. I'd also really like to thank Rebecca Estelle, who is signing this program for us this afternoon. Now, I'd like to introduce Katie Booth. Katie's work has appeared in The Believer, Catapult, McSweeney's, and Harper's Magazine, and has been highlighted on long reads and long form. The sign for this was a notable essay in the 2016 edition of Best American Essays. Booth received a number of prestigious fellowships to support research for the invention of miracles, including from the Library of Congress and the Massachusetts Historical Society. She was raised in a mixed hearing and deaf family. This is her first book. So Katie, welcome. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Lynn. And thank you everybody for being here. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to read excerpts from the book and sort of talk a little bit in between. I usually begin with the prologue. These are some excerpts from the prologue that sort of read together as a story. And it's in a little bit of a different voice from the rest of the book, but it gives a nice overview, I think, or some basic background information for a hearing audience who might not necessarily already know the deep impact that Bell had on the deaf community. And so I'll begin. It also talks a little bit about my personal connection to the story and what brought me to writing this book. So I'll begin with the prologue. In the hospital bed, my grandmother faced the window, bathed in the bluish light of the rising moon. I watched her body, memorizing it, the wrinkles of her fingers, the way her jawbone tucked back into her neck, the way her tongue moved like a soft oyster in the shell of her mouth. I had known her my whole life, but I had never before seen her weak. Now it was hard to look at her. The roundness of her body, which once seemed so soft and warm, was only heavy, seemed only to pin her to that hospital bed. Her usual facial expressions, eyes sharp, mouth firm, was now resigned, tired. Her head lay on the pillow, her gray hair, thin and oily, was swept back from her face, and her eyes were blank and dark. She wasn't dead, not yet, but something had shifted. Normally, I saw my grandmother in her home among her deaf community, where apartments were set up with blinking lights for alarms, where telephones released little scrolls of typed English, and where furniture was arranged for open sight lines in order to use ASL across rooms. She lived among the culturally deaf, defined by the use of ASL and observation of deaf cultural norms. And in those spaces, my grandmother had more access to information than I did. With friends, she communicated with quick, fluent ASL. And even when I could get the gist of individual words, I could still tell there were layers and layers of meaning that were escaping me. They were carried in the small twitch of an eyebrow, the subtle lift of a corner of the lip, an invasion of space, or a quick shift away. In her world, she was firm, strong, steady. But here in the hospital, things were different. My grandmother had suffered her heart attack 4 days before and had been in the hospital alone for the 3 days that followed. Only then did anyone get in touch with my family. In the meantime, my grandmother's presence barely seemed to have registered. My grandmother, through notes scrawled in English, had made several requests, few of which seemed to have been addressed. She'd asked for someone to contact us, for a TTY, which is sort of text-based telephone device, so that she could call us herself. She'd asked for an interpreter at least 4 times before we arrived and received one only once. With almost no information, she went on waiting for us. For those 3 days, we had no idea she was lying there. I was 19 at the time. I took a late night Greyhound back home from college and accompanied my mother to the hospital the next morning. From my grandmother's room, my ears strained to hear my mother. I could capture phrases like Americans with Disabilities Act and informed consent and civil rights, legal code words that culminated in violation of federal law. She was battling for my grandmother's right to access her own language, her right to understand and to be understood. By this point, in the early 2000s, the broader deaf community had been entrenched in this fight for nearly 150 years. They'd been fighting ever since one of the foremost teachers of the deaf began to say that ASL was unnecessary, that the deaf could do without it and should be forced to, if possible. In the hearing world, this teacher is renowned, but not for the generations-long struggle he began. He's known as a plucky inventor. A man who helped people to communicate across cities, across nations, across oceans. In the deaf world, however, he's remembered with rage. He's the man who launched a war in which the deaf would have to fight for their lives. My mother's voice, violation of federal law, lingered in the air, but it felt like legal protections mattered little. We had to explain yet again that the deaf were legally and ethically entitled to the free use of their language, that my grandmother had the right to know why she'd been hospitalized, that she had the right to contact us, that she was human and that her language was real and true and necessary and wholly distinct from English. It was never more vivid to me that until we could usher in a widespread understanding of ASL as a dignified and necessary language, deaf culture and deaf lives remained at risk. The theft of this language, culture, and dignity was the legacy of Alexander Graham Bell. I grew up between English and ASL, between the worlds of hearing and deafness. My maternal grandparents lived just around the bend from my house. In their home, we didn't speak since we didn't need to. We needed neither speech nor its accompanying language, English. Instead, our eyes were trained to respond to the slightest movements in our periphery. We scanned the visual world, both for information and language. And when we spoke, we did so with our hands and our bodies. Our language was intimate. It was private, something most people didn't know. It required close attention on each other's faces. And so we spent our conversations looking into each other's eyes. And since it doesn't lend itself to multitasking, when we were doing something else, we filled those moments not with the clatter of speech, but with the tenderness of observation, of taking each other in. Of course, I was only a child and much of this was lost on me. It was simply the way we lived. I didn't think much about my grandparents' deafness, but there were mysteries inside of it that grabbed me even then. My grandmother had told me countless times that she couldn't hear anything, and I mostly believed her, but I was also fundamentally confused. I thought her deafness applied only to outside sounds like my voice or the honk of a car. For some reason, I still thought she could hear her own body, the gurgle of her stomach or the hum of her voice before it released. I thought she could hear herself shimmering inside like I could. And I always imagined this is how she learned to speak. It wasn't completely wrong. There is a shimmering, a vibration, a sensation that spreads out from the speech organs that she could use to understand the sounds she made. But she couldn't hear herself the way I understood hearing. We were sitting on her screened-in porch when she told me again that she couldn't hear anything at all, not even herself. Someone taught her to speak anyway. My eyebrows furrowed in. My grandmother bent her body down to the floor to reach for one of my coloring books and tore off the corner of a page. She sat back, held the torn slip in front of her lips and said, "Puh," and the piece of paper blew back. "That's how," she said, as if that explained everything. But it explained nothing. Instead, it opened a breathless rush of questions inside of me. But before I could ask anything, my grandmother saw the uncertainty begin to gather on my face. She sighed and stood. "Wait here," she said, and went into the house, where I could hear her rummaging around in the kitchen. When she returned, she held a birthday candle between her pointer and thumb. She lit it and held it hot in front of my face. "Say puh," she said. I did, and the flame flickered in my breath. She brought it up to her mouth, said puh, and blew it out. "Like that," she said. I still didn't believe her. It didn't seem like this could be a way to learn to speak. Besides, she couldn't always be trusted. She was the type of woman who cheated at Go Fish and then refused to look up at you so that you couldn't argue with her. Now her eyes pressed into me and I nodded, complicit in her con. I could understand how the flame could help her say the letter P, but what about all the other letters? What about the mms and the shs, the grrs and the ahs? I thought it was just another one of her tricks. Later that day, I asked my mother about it, and she confirmed what my grandmother had told me. She explained that when my grandmother went to school in the 30s, teachers would do whatever they could to help the students see the sounds so that they could understand whether they were making the sound the right way or the wrong way. A student who pronounced m instead of p couldn't blow out a candle. And from that simple notion of learning to see sound, unraveled a cultural story that would follow me for years. My mother told me that long ago, people thought that sign language was bad, and they punished the students who used it in school. The teachers slapped the students' palms or made them sit on their hands. This is what happened to my grandmother's whole generation. My grandmother, my grandfather, my great aunts and uncles, they were all deaf and they were all punished. This education was called oralism, my mother said, and it hurt our family very much. Everyone's hands were bruised. Children in oralist schools were supposed to use English and only English, speak English, lip read English, read and write English. It took priority over all other learning. Often it entirely displaced other learning. Deaf children who signed, even accidentally, were scolded, mocked, denied their social outings, and their hands were hit. The scars of these educations are deep, they are real. My great aunt Rita rarely used her voice when I knew her. She maintained that her speaking peers were on a higher level, and her own voice, she said, was ugly. When she laughed, she did so silently. This is what the schools taught deaf children, whose laughter was too unbridled, too loud, or too free. When her husband, my great uncle, died, we tried to call her, but she wouldn't respond. A teacher had once told her that she sounded like an animal when she cried, so she cried alone. On his deathbed, my grandfather told my mother that he wouldn't be going to heaven. God doesn't love me, he said, because I'm stupid, because I'm low, because I sign. This happened when I was 7, but I wouldn't learn about it until years later. By then, I knew who to blame. By then, I had learned that Bell's legacy went even deeper, even darker than I'd known. When we covered the Holocaust in school, I learned that Hitler targeted the Jews. At home, I learned that he also targeted the deaf and the disabled, and that decades before Hitler, at the very beginning of the eugenics movement, there was Bell. He wanted deaf people eradicated, their marriages to each other forbidden, their procreation ceased. I understood this. If Bell had had it his way, my great aunts and great uncles wouldn't be here. My grandmother wouldn't be here. And by extension, my mother wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be here. And so when my grade school social studies book said that Alexander Graham Bell was the inventor of the telephone, it sounded as absurd to me as introducing Adolf Hitler as a vegetarian who once ruled over Germany. Bell didn't just want my family's language and culture to be obliterated. He wanted us as a people to be obliterated. I didn't understand how he could arrive at that idea, and even less could I understand how he could get away with it. Nevertheless, there he was, a black and white photo of a man with a white beard, bright black eyes, a man who looked dignified, controlled, a man who represented all hearing ignorance and violence against the deaf. It was clear to me as a child And then later, looking down at my grandmother's body, Bell was responsible not only for his own actions, but also for the actions of the inheritors of his mindset. So I'm going to pause there in the prologue. I'm going to skip forward a little bit in the book. So I came to this work, to this book, with a lot of pain. It was pain around my grandmother's death. It was shortly after her death that I started the research. But it was also pain around her life, pain around the lives that I was learning my relatives had to live because of the way their native language was shamed and denied to many other deaf people, and including some of my relatives. My grandfather, for example, he didn't grow up in a deaf family, and so he was sent to school without knowing sign language. And because he didn't have access to sign language at school, he didn't learn any language. Learning to speak and lip read English was tremendously, and is still tremendously difficult for many deaf people. And so he didn't learn any language until his 20s. This causes something called language deprivation, which is essentially an epidemic in the deaf world to this day. And it hinders brain development among children that extends into adulthood and is irreversible. So I came to this project with all of that, with a lot of frustration, a lot of pain. But then when I started looking closely at Bell, when I started really digging into the archives, I found that he was nothing like what I thought. I'd grown up with this idea of him as a villain, as somebody who was just pure evil. But in fact, he was really, really, really complicated. And early in his career, he worked really closely with deaf students, and he really seemed to want what was best for them. The way he went about it didn't end up working, and he turned away from evidence to that. But he was, especially early in his career, really invested. So a lot of people are curious about what this education really looked like. And so I'm going to read a little bit about his, one of his early experiences teaching in an American school. He grew up in Scotland, moved to London, then Canada, and then came to America. This is right after he comes to America, within a week. At the Boston school, his lessons began on April 11th at 11 Pemberton Square. At the opening of the school day, Sarah Fuller, the principal, directed the children into their seats and took her place at the head of the classroom. There were 32 students, all of whom clasped their hands and watched Miss Fuller's lips as she began the Lord's Prayer. She said it slowly, so that even the youngest, those only 6 or 7 years old, could follow, could learn this most necessary pattern. Alec admired, Alexander Graham Bell went by the name of Alec, so he'll be referred to here. Alec admired Miss Fuller immediately, her modesty, her skill, the way she overflowed with genuine goodness. Her face was plain and pleasant, her hair parted down the middle and pulled back. In every manner, she presented herself conservatively, tending towards dark, unpatterned dresses with only minimal ruffles, no bows on her neckline or curls to her hair. She gave the impression of someone serious and focused, someone much like Alex, who was not wearing his dress coat, which he forgot in Tutela Heights. They both seemed to understand there were more important things than dress, more pressing issues on the mind. There was a shimmer of purpose throughout the Boston school. The teachers understood that they were experimenting with a new method, and that if it failed, it would be seen as a failure not only of this school, but also of the idea more broadly. If they succeeded, however, they would help prove that speech could be taught to the deaf. More than that, they would help prove something well beyond the classroom, that deaf people could be folded into the hearing world, that their difference could be erased. This is what they wanted for deaf people. The fact that this was not what deaf people were asking for didn't concern them. When Miss Fuller finished the opening prayer, Alex gathered the younger students, and several of the teachers stayed to observe. He began with the face. He drew it on the blackboard. Then he pointed to the parts of the face, and the students pointed to their own faces. Then he began to teach the symbols of visible speech, which he explained to the students using gestures and signs. Visible speech, as a little aside, visible speech is a phonetic alphabet that Bell's father developed so that they could more easily teach different languages to different people. Bell was tasked with the purpose of taking this alphabet and using it to teach deaf children to speak. And so that was his approach to this. Within a half hour, students were able to identify and sign the names of several classes of symbols. At the back of the class, Alex saw Dexter King, who ran the school, his strong face and his white hair, watching on. Before Alex came to the school, Miss Fuller had tried to understand visible speech herself, but she had come away worried that it was too complex. For the students to understand it, they would essentially have to learn a whole new alphabet. It was hard even for her to learn it. But Alex accomplished the task in 30 minutes. Miss Fuller wasn't the only one who was impressed. Quote, "I may say the teachers were thunderstruck," wrote Alex. Among them was Miss True, Mabel Hubbard's private teacher, who had taken a position at the Boston school. Mabel Hubbard will become one of Bell's students and then later his wife. Miss True watched Alex closely. His alphabet, his presence at the blackboard, the white chalk outline of the face. As students said their words, he emphasized the parts of the mouth that would need to be adjusted to move closer to the correct sound. Instead of the English alphabet, whose symbols are arbitrary and might represent any number of sounds, just think about vowels, the symbols of visible speech related to each other. Similar sounds had similar characters, similar shapes, and a character stood only for a single sound. The relationships of speech were made visible, and so Alex used his alphabet as a bridge, the visual that made progress possible and memorable. Though Alex, the teachers all watched him with astonishment, and though they were meant to learn from his techniques, it seemed impossible without his abilities. He was, they believed, gifted. They believed this was what he was put on this earth to do. Though Alex may have been gifted, he also worked obsessively. After his first day teaching, he went back to his boarding house, and in his room, he struggled with the L sounds. He studied his own tongue in the mirror as he repeated bottle lifter and battle, laugh, bottle, lifter. The L's all seemed different somehow. Alex needed to iron out all of the details so that he could teach. He'd worked with the students only for one day, but he was already in deep. How could he explain the differences lift, laugh, bottle, laugh. He spent the evening copying down characters onto cardboard. He thought about miscommunication. He'd heard the story of a clergyman just a few days earlier teaching the gospel to the deaf. The clergyman had explained the story of Job being affected by boils, and when he decided to check comprehension, he asked a young boy to repeat the story back to him. The boy did with vigor and explained that God had boiled Job for 7 days. The next day, April 12th, was Alex's first American exhibition. The students had worked with him for only a few hours the day before, and now they would represent what could be done. He planned it this way specifically to demonstrate the ease of the system and how much could be accomplished with such short time. The schoolroom filled with officials, parents, educators, and journalists gathered to see what the students could do. And then, when Alex showed the children a particular symbol, the students shaped their mouths accordingly and spoke. The audience marveled at their quick understanding and the speed at which their words approached correct pronunciation. They looked at the copies of the visible speech alphabet and they sat in quiet awe. When it came to Alex's method, someone would always be observing, always questioning, always reporting. There were raised eyebrows, but usually they would lower again, at least in the beginning. Word began traveling through mothers, teachers, statesmen. Word traveled to other regional deaf schools, to other parts of the state. It traveled to New York and to Washington, D.C. Soon, Alex was in high demand. He traveled New England. He visited the Clark School and the American Asylum, where he taught a classroom of 250 deaf students the symbols of visible speech. Then, like a conductor, he signaled for them to speak. He arced his hand across a crowd of students and sound rose from their throats, loud enough to make the floor tremble, the windows rattle. Sound traveled through the halls out the window and filled the street. The second he signaled again, it stopped. When it began again, it was louder. It was said to be heard a quarter mile away, and the pedestrians outside stalled on the sidewalk in wonder. If Alex's technique worked as well as it seemed to, it could change everything. Alec believed it could, or rather, he believed speech could, though he had always been skeptical of lip reading. He thought that was a sham. He says, "My father and I thought we knew too much about the mechanism of speech to believe in such stuff as that." He thought it was really just the deaf child observing context and making inferences. Out of politeness, he didn't mention this to Miss Fuller, but instead he began to wonder if he could build a sort of speech reading device, something to serve the same purpose as hearing, of understanding the speech of another. He thought he could make a machine, something that could allow speech to be read by the eyes, a machine that could capture and transform the vibrations of voice. So spoiler alert, the machine is the telephone. Bell's work on oralism and on trying to help deaf children learn how to speak, it led him straight into the invention of the telephone, as well as his connections in deaf education. If it weren't for those connections, he wouldn't have had the funding or the support to have made that invention a reality. Although there is some controversy over how much credit he deserves as opposed to some other inventors around the same time. And Bell's work on oralism would make it the dominant form of deaf education by the turn of the century. Even though deaf people largely opposed it. It was really, really hard for deaf people, and it got in the way of other learning. But even more importantly, for deaf people like my grandfather, who really struggled to access spoken English and lip reading, it meant they didn't have any language input at all, and it led to language deprivation. And so it caused widespread harm, despite what Bell wanted it to do, which was really to help. He really wanted it to help. What was even worse was that his promotion of it and his fear-mongering about sign language led him into eugenics thought. He began to advocate that deaf people shouldn't marry each other. And more so, and this is a little bit lost to history, but he was also saying that hearing people with deaf people in their families also shouldn't marry deaf people. He was worried about the genetics. It should be noted that by this measure, he should not have married his own wife. Bell's mother was deaf and his wife was deaf. And his wife also had other deaf cousins, so there was deafness in her family as well. Bell acknowledged this, but he didn't really let it get in the way of his promotion of the restriction of deaf marriage. So I'm just going to read one last thing. It's shorter, and it talks a little bit about that part of his life, the very end of his life, when he is more invested in these eugenics ideas, and when his wife is becoming pretty uncomfortable with that. Now Mabel said almost nothing about any of Alex's work, only that as he stood behind podiums wearing his dark woolen suits and delivering lectures filled with warnings about a deaf race, she missed him. She was involved with the Washington elite, but she never really felt completely comfortable in those circles. When Alex was away, she wrote to him loyally, filling him in on the minutiae of her days and her pleas for him to return. She writes, "I like you around, even if you are a bother sometimes. You are the mainspring of my life, and though it goes, or when it goes, the other wheels go on by themselves for a time. It is very languidly and more slowly, and I want you back to give me an interest in life." Her life was now split between their homes in Washington, D.C. and Canada, their Baddock, Nova Scotia estate, though they increasingly spent more time in Canada. She loved the days when her family was all together there, when she could have boys' clothes specifically made to fit her daughters so that they could wear pants and climb trees, where her favorite gift was an axe, and where Alex worked not on deafness, but on sheep breeding and boat building and kite flying. Mabel described him for his mother, Eliza, as, quote, a big burly figure in his familiar knickerbockers, which made him look like a big schoolboy among the Lilliputians. How different he was in Canada from the man who stood at podiums and gave speeches on deafness and marriage. And how different they both were now from what it was in the beginning, when he traveled to Nantucket to deliver her a letter. This is a letter where he confesses his love to her. Back then, he believed he had to know and respect what she thought, and that their future would be written together. She didn't go down to meet him that day in Nantucket, but from a window she might have seen him, his black hair askew, his dark eyes shining, everything about him naked for her, his desire and love, and underneath that, his hope that he could offer her something. He could offer companionship, but this too, He wanted to make the world different for her. She couldn't have imagined this was how he would do it. He wanted to save her from ever knowing her own deafness. He wrote, "My great strong love would shield you." But her deafness was a part of her. She may not have communicated through ASL, but her experience was not the same as someone who could hear. This was something Alex did his best not to acknowledge, and it was something that she worked her whole life to leave unacknowledged. Alex put the onus of change on deaf people. They had to control their voices, their language, their love. But deaf people had a different kind of change in mind. There was another idea that had grown exponentially in strength since the dawn of oralism, one that placed itself largely in opposition to oralism and broader hearing-centric ideologies. And that was that deaf people were simply a distinct culture with common language and common values. They didn't need to be fixed. All they needed was a chance. In a slightly altered social environment, they wouldn't even have to be all that different. They could just be themselves and powerful. And I'll end there. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has. Yeah.
Thank you, Katie. This was so interesting and moving, really moving. We have a question here that you touched on in reference to his family. From Taylor, was Alexander Graham Bell a teacher at a deaf school in his early life? And how did he gain so much influence in hurting the deaf community?
Yeah, Bell mostly worked he mostly worked to train other teachers. He did work for a short amount of time in a London deaf school really early on. And then his brother started to get really sick with tuberculosis. This was the mid-19th century. Tuberculosis was just tearing through London, tearing through a lot of places. And so the family, in order to save Bell's life, essentially, he had started to show symptoms. They uprooted the family and moved to Canada. And it sort of put an end to this work he had started with deaf people. And then because of his father's prominence, his father was a famous elocutionist, which means kind of like the closest thing we have today is like a speech language pathologist. He taught people to speak better, but it was of a different level of importance in the 19th century than it is today. So he was very famous, Bell's father, and somebody had written to his father to see if he could come to the Boston school, which was the excerpt that I read from. And Bell's father didn't want to do it, but he sent Alex. And so Alex taught there, and then, yeah, word spread really quickly. The idea of assimilation was really strong at that moment in time, and people were very, very concerned about difference. And so deaf people were sort of targeted in that way. And the idea of them speaking English was very exciting, very intoxicating. About 90% of deaf children, roughly, are born to hearing parents. And so the cultural, the handing down of the culture doesn't happen through parents. And so parents, I think, were very interested in having a child who they could speak with without having to themselves learn what seemed to them to be a strange new language. And so there was a lot of support from parents, from statesmen, and from teachers. And Bell traveled to all these different deaf schools to try to teach his methods. And that's how he became really influential. He also tutored deaf children one-on-one for a long time. And he started a school where he taught deaf teachers his methods. He started that in Boston. Later in life, he started his own school in Washington, D.C. And that was where he observed the failure of his own methods, but he didn't change. He didn't back down from them. And I think that's something he can be held responsible for. And he can be held responsible for a lot of things, but at first, you're trying something new. There's, there's a way you can sort of justify some amount of experimentation, but when you see the harm it's doing firsthand and you turn away from that, and you're also the whole time turning away from deaf people and deaf teachers who are telling you it's not working and it's causing harm. Those are things that I think we can point to as moments where he could have done something different. And so I think there was like this, what was the second part of that question? Sort of how he
got so much influence. Yeah, I think you've addressed that. Yeah.
And then the telephone, of course.
Yeah.
Once he invented the telephone, then everybody's going to listen to him about anything because he's the telephone guy.
Yeah, right. I was interested in what you were saying about assimilation, because it reminded me of the role of in the insistence on English in Native American boarding schools also, which was another attempt, not exactly corresponding in time, but close enough, where the goal was assimilation into mainstream society, and one of the prominent requirements was the speaking of English.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I think, overlap there. I think one of the things that protected deaf people was the fact that they are so often born to hearing parents. And so like the deaf schools were by no means safe places, but in a lot of ways, but they didn't have the extreme physical abuse and torture and sort of pulling apart of families that those Native, the schools for Native Americans often had. I mean, deaf schools had a lot of their own problems, but I think that the deaf children's proximity to hearing parents did offer some protection at that time. Yeah.
So I've read that your book has elicited a little controversy.
It has, yeah.
Yeah, can you talk about that at all, if you'd like to?
Sure. I mean, I think part of the controversy, part of it has to do with, I think Bell's descendants are very dedicated to preserving a particular image of Bell, and that image has come under attack, not under attack, but it's been revised by a lot of historians, not just me, and not just in terms of deafness, right? He was involved in the eugenics movement. There are questions to how he invented the telephone, what information he might have gotten from other inventors through dubious means. And so I think Bell has become a really complicated figure as we've had more time to look at the documents. And as those documents have become public, they were not always public. So I think Bell's image has changed. Like a lot of historical figures, we now can look at him not only for things that he did that were really, really good, but also the things he did that were not good. I mean, we see this with, President FDR, right? Like there are a lot of people who were very complicated, who caused harm to minorities, And I frankly don't think it's right to try to erase that. I think that it causes more harm and more enduring harm. And yet there's a lot of investment by his descendants and by his sort of organizational descendants. So there's two organizations that carry his name and that continue his philosophy. And the philosophy of oralism is not dead. It continues in a form of education called listening and spoken language, which is essentially modern day oralism aimed mostly at children who have cochlear implants and who are hard of hearing. And there are nuances that make it different from oralism. But by the same measure, you could say that sign language education has also changed. It just didn't change its name a million times. So I think there are people who want to protect legacy, and I'm interested in protecting legacy too. Well, I'm interested in protecting a deaf story that has been caught up in 150 years of attempts to erase it. And so I think if we look at both of those stories and wonder which one needs protection, not that I'm protecting deaf people, I'm not. Deaf people can, they protect me. I think we can see which narrative is dominant and which one needs to be lifted out, needs a little bit more sunlight, needs a little bit more recognition. And I think that's the story of some of the harm that he did while he was trying to do good.
Yes, yes. And, the eugenics movement, for example, was extremely popular at a certain point in history, and he would have been far from the only person promoting those ideas.
Yes, but I do want to say, because I feel like this gets lost a lot when we talk about eugenics, there were also a lot of people opposing it at the time and saying it's wrong. It's not like it was just, like everyone thought it. There was vocal opposition to eugenics at the time, just as there was vocal opposition to oralism at the time. It's just a matter of who gets listened to.
Yes, good. I have a couple more questions, but if other people in the audience would like to post anything in the Q&A, feel free to do that. One of my questions is something I like to ask authors, and it has to do with what's not in your book. Right, we all have these challenges when we're working with publishers about length, and I'm wondering if there is anything that you discovered in your research that you wish you could have included in the book that you weren't able to.
Oh wow, yeah, like so many things, and the book ended up being much longer than I thought it would be. Like when it was all put together, I was like, oh, did I write a long book? It's not. I mean, in terms of biography, it's not long, but it's longer than I thought it would be. There was a lot that I didn't put in the book. There was a lot from my early research, which wasn't as focused on Bell and was more focused on the Clark School for the Deaf. I began this research by interviewing a lot of the alum of the Clark School for the Deaf around the time that my grandparents my great aunts and uncles were there. And so there was a lot about that I mean, really had no business in the final book, but was absolutely critical to my early understanding of the complications of this method of education. I was raised in deaf culture, and so I thought that this was very simply just bad. And yet talking to those other alum who were raised in very different environments, and who were themselves deaf, I'm hearing, I have a lot of hearing privilege. It limits what I can understand. And so talking to them and hearing those stories and hearing my great aunt's stories, some of which are in the book, but not most of them, that changed me as a person. And this book wouldn't have been possible without it. And in a way, I am sad that they didn't make it into the book, even though I know that in terms of art and composition. They didn't really belong there, but I wish I could have honored those stories in that way.
Mhm.
And the other big thing is the contemporary research on language deprivation, which has so many brilliant deaf people at the helm. And they're working on like in so many multi-dimensional, they're coming at it from a lot of different fields. And I am not as plugged into that. I've done my research, but it's moving so quickly and faster than I could really keep up with and integrate into what is really a history book. I do touch upon it later in the book and in moments throughout the book, the idea of language deprivation, but the work that those researchers are doing right now is amazing. And I mean, I couldn't possibly get into it without doing a whole other book. But that's another thing that I guess I kind of wish I had more space and time and headspace for.
Good. Good. One last question then, and this is kind of a broad question. You know, we were talking before the webinar actually started about kind of cultural histories, and it seems to me that there have been so many cultural changes in kind of American mainstream life between the 19th century, early 20th century, and the early 21st century. And I'm wondering if any of those changes that don't appear to be directly related to either deaf culture or the treatment of disability, what we call disability more generally, have given you any insights into shifts in our approaches to difference, let's say, in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think it's often true that our conversations about race move faster than conversations about other difference. And so I spend a lot of time trying to understand what's happening in those conversations and see how that translates to my experience as a hearing person with deaf family members. And it's really because of those conversations in the mainstream that I was able to really begin to tackle my own privilege as a hearing person and how that was affecting the way I was writing this book and the way I was looking at these issues historically. And also to wonder how I could do better, how I could both as a researcher and as a human and as a writer and all of these ways, how I could acknowledge that privilege and in a way that was productive and not just like, oh, I'm so privileged. Like, and so I tried to bring that into the book, especially in the prologue and afterword, and really grapple with that. I also think another group that is often informative to me in terms of looking back, I mean, obviously I follow conversations in the deaf world too, but deafness, because most deaf children aren't born to deaf parents, it's more of a horizontal identity. It's an identity that forms not through families, but through groups, through peers. And it means that there's a lot of things that are similar in the queer community, which also is a horizontal identity. And so I often find that there are conversations going on over here that it can sort of shine some light on things that I'm seeing as a hearing person in proximity to deafness.
Yeah, interesting. And then one last question from the audience about whether there is anything else people could read to inform themselves that you'd recommend about deaf culture.
Oh my gosh, there's, I mean, good question. I guess it depends how you want to read, like what you want to read. There's so much. Sarah Novich just came out with a novel called True Biz. I believe it's on the New York Times bestseller list about a deaf residential school. It's fictional, but she
True
is deaf.
Biz, is that
What was that?
True Biz? Is that the title?
True Biz. It's a deaf idiom. It means like, I think it means like yeah, like I don't know how to try, like for real or something. I don't. I'm gonna screw it up. Don't quote me on that.
Okay.
And Elsa Hannesson just came out. She's deafblind. She just came out with a memoir and sort of cultural critique called Being Seen. I mean, one of my favorite writers is John Lee Clark, who is also deafblind. So he's writing more from a deafblind perspective, but he became blind and grew up deaf. So he sort of straddles these worlds. I think one of the, I mean, it's a little older, but Carol Padden and Tom Humphreys have worked together to write a number of sort of primers on deaf culture that are excellent. I think some of the ideas culturally, excuse me, have shifted a bit since then, but it's still excellent. Octavian Robinson is a historian who has great stuff out there. I don't believe a book, but I could be wrong. I know he has a lot of journal articles. Yeah, I don't know. There's so many.
Okay.
I just can't.
Well, that certainly is a good start.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we have reached just after 2 o'clock. And I really want to thank you, Katie, and also thank you, Rebecca, for helping us out here. This has been really interesting, really engaging. And again, this recording will be posted on YouTube in a few days. And I will look forward to hoping to see some of you others in the audience back joining us next fall when we resume. Okay. Thank you and goodbye.